All right. Welcome everyone to our, I think this is fifth session of our EETF Eurasian Environment series. And thank you as always for finding the time in the evening to attend this after work and learn together with us. So today with us we have Nicholas Seay, and I'm going to turn it over to Alicia to introduce him and the presentation. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about Tajikistan. So Alicia.
Right. Well, again, I echo Sandra. Thanks to making the time to come out tonight, especially I know that spring semester is very, very hectic. But that said, I'm very excited to introduce you all to a very beloved colleague and graduate student from Ohio State today. Nick C. is a PhD student in the history department at Ohio State. Prior to coming to our university, he received his BA from the University of Cincinnati and also received an MA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So he's very familiar with our colleagues over in Wisconsin as well. But based on archival history and library research conducted in Tajikistan between 2022 and 2023, his dissertation explores development of the cotton sector in late Soviet Tajikistan. So without further ado, I will let Nick take the metaphorical mic and he will be discussing the making of monoculture, water, and environment in Soviet Tajikistan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alicia and Sandra, and thanks for organizing this series, which seems really great. I'm actually curious to hear what the other talks have been about. And yeah, big thank you to all the teachers here who, after a long day in the classroom, are coming to join us because they just want to really get into the history. So much appreciated. I know how tiring it can be. So yeah, in this talk today, which is based on my bigger dissertation project, I'm just going to take a small sliver of that project and talk about kind of water and the environmental history of Soviet Central Asia, and with some case studies from Soviet Tajikistan. And basically, I want to try to understand how the environment of Central Asia shaped the Soviet development project there. And we're going to focus on cotton monoculture. We're going to look at the diversion of rivers and basically how it reshaped not only environment but the labor practices in the region. And what I would ask of you is to think about how this, centering the environment in the story and thinking about how Soviet policies were shaped by that environmental context in the region and vice versa, because they're kind of interlocking in some ways. Um, so my plan for today is kind of to give a lot of background context on Central Asia, how it was colonized by the Russian Empire, to talk about the early Soviet period, and then we'll kind of dive more closely into Tajikistan and some of the stuff I found in my research. Um, but I think before we do that, I kind of want to make this little interactive. So um, you can see my slides, correct? Okay. I know that you have been learning about Eurasian environments and over the past several months, I think. And I'm curious to hear like what comes to mind when you think of Eurasian environments. What are some of the case studies that you've been hearing about in the other presentations and in your reading? I've put some images of what comes to mind when I think of Eurasian environments, but I was curious to hear from some of you. So if you can unmute your mic and talk if you want. You can also drop something in the chat. But what comes to mind when we think of Eurasian environments? Okay, so I'm going to read some comments in the chat. So, like the US, I think of attempts to control the environment by people who didn't originally live there. Yes, absolutely. We'll be talking about this concept today. Kind of, and I would frame that as even the entanglement of imperialism as control over people, but also control over the environment. That's definitely a theme that we see in Eurasia. Anything else that comes to mind? Human engineering. Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to elaborate on that, Candice?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to find my mic here. Yeah, so when we study, especially through this course, but in the past and probably during the Soviet era especially, it seems like everything, and I guess I'm thinking of the extreme building under Stalin,
Hmm.
whether it was in Soviet Union itself or in, I think pretty sure there were some places in South America they were doing it as well. I just can't think of one, building in like entire cities and forcing whatever they decided would be appropriate. Even though we may have done that in this country as well, but I think to more of an extreme, when I'm saying engineering, they're building buildings, um, completely changing the the geography, the layout, the
Hmm.
topography. Whereas, and
Yeah.
I think that we did that too in, the United States as well, and probably more so at maybe the turn of the century, but I think because we preserved the parks, and maybe I just
Hmm.
don't know enough about what they did or did not do. So, I know there was some park features put in place.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. No, those are all really great points. And, I'm not an expert in the U.S., but when we think about something like the Tennessee Valley, right, during the 1930s, and I would say like that's the one case that usually stands out when I think about Tajikistan because basically it's the same set of policies, right? You're building dams, you're moving people closer to those space. Well, you're clearing people out so that you can build the dams, but then you're trying to build cities around the hydroelectricity that you've created because of these dam projects, and that this is like a policy that you develop so that you can improve lives and bring modernity to these rural regions. Like it's almost exactly the same process. The timeline is somewhat different in Central Asia, and we'll talk about that. Like for instance, you mentioned Stalin. I would actually say like the most intensive period, yeah, I'll get to that in a second. The most intensive period for Central Asia is actually in the 50s and 60s under Khrushchev and then into the Brezhnev era, and we'll talk about that today. And yeah, there's this whole system of zapovedniki, these kind of nature reserves, um, and that has a slightly different history than the national parks. But the I guess the main difference I would say with the Zapovedniki is that they were interested in preserving nature, but not as a place that people could go and enjoy. That seems to be the main difference. But they were interested in conservation and kind of like creating these spaces of untouched nature. And if you're interested in that, after when we get to the Q&A, I can suggest some reading to talk about that more. Um, Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much for this. Um, your comments actually lead us into the discussion today because we are going to be talking about water and human engineering and attempts to change the environment and change people and change society through our changes of the environment. That's kind of a key tenet of Soviet environmental and development policy. Um, And, when we talk about, I mean, we're going to be talking mostly about Central Asia today. So Central Asia has a very specific set of environments and landscapes that are also important to realize as we talk about um, development in Tajikistan and in Central Asia more broadly. So I'm curious, is anyone familiar with Central Asia? Like what comes to mind when we think about Central Asian environments? And we're talking about the stands, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. So what comes to mind? And whatever comes to mind, I'd be happy to hear you throw it out there. Yeah, steppe. So steppe is one important thing, and this is, the northern half, especially of Central Asia. So this northern half of Kazakhstan, basically into Lake Balkhash. What else um, besides steppe land comes to mind? Don't be shy.
I'm gonna just talk because it would be easier. Sorry, I was having issues there for a second. I always think of things mainly because I teach AP World History,
Okay.
a lot with, nomadic peoples, and
Hmm.
especially if you get into the Mongols and all of that, like
Right.
I look at it and I start to break it down, into the different Khanates and everything.
Yeah.
So I look at it differently, I guess, sometimes, besides just what's in front of me.
Yeah. Yeah, and so, that is kind of the association people have is like the nomadic lifestyle, the steppe grass and that's certainly true for Kazakhstan, but when we get closer to Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, like there are steppe oases, but it's also a lot of irrigation and mountains. So when we look at Tajikistan, for example, the statistic that everyone likes to say is it's 93% mountains, and then you have 7% of these little valleys between the mountains. And that's mostly where they're doing all of this cotton growing that we're going to be talking about. But in Tajikistan, there really isn't any steppes. So once we get down further south in this region of Central Asia, we're mostly dealing with arid deserts. We're dealing with like rivers, we're dealing with some mountains, and then, these valleys between those mountains. And here's kind of a better image so we can see where we're talking about. So yeah, steppe is on there. We have these mountain ranges. So there's the Tian Shan mountain range and the Pamirs. And those really are only in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. You have another mountain range that's is kind of between them. It's called Zarafshan, and that juts into Uzbekistan a little bit. But this is important because this also helps us understand the way that the river system works in Central Asia. You have these high elevations, and you have these mountains, and basically seasonally the ice and the snow in these mountains melts, and then you start to get these smaller rivers, and then they become bigger, and then eventually you have these two huge rivers that go through the region. So in the south, basically on the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, you have the Amu Darya, and it flows northward toward the Aral Sea. And then north of that, you have the Seay Darya, which also flows into the Aral Sea. And these are long-standing features of the region. If we go back to the third century, fourth century BC, the Greeks had a term for this part of the world. They called it Transoxiana, the land beyond the Oxus River, which is their term for the Amu Darya. And the Arabs, when they invaded the region in the seventh and eighth century, they called it I should have it here, Mawara al-Nahar, the land beyond the river. So they kind of actually stole the Greek name, but they developed it themselves. And this was like an important defining feature for them. Like the river was kind of the frontier zone of Central Asia. But this also tells us that these rivers defined life in the region, for centuries, not only recently, but going all the way back to antiquity. And finally, I would add that like we have to think about aridity and heat. This is really important for the cotton story. So these are really dry climates, pretty close to no precipitation. You get places where it's like less than 200 millimeters per season. Part of that is also because of the Tian Shan Mountains, the fact that like these mountains act as a huge wall or barrier almost, preventing precipitation from further east coming into this zone. So it's a very dry zone. There's lots of deserts. I thought about including some pictures of me just like sweating in the middle of summer. It's like 110 degrees out. And it's just like that for hours and hours a day and for months at a time. Basically, from May all the way until October, it's like these really intense um, temperatures, and the sun, is beating down on you for forever and ever. So this is really good if you want to grow cotton here, as long as you have water. But also, it's really bad if you want to grow cotton because this is like a really difficult climate to work in, and that's kind of the trade-off that we'll be thinking about. So, any questions on that? I know I covered a lot. Greeks and rivers and mountains. But that's kind of the context that we're dealing with. Okay, not seeing anything, so let's keep going. Okay, so talking about the political history a little bit and where we're talking about. So what's really important um, is to also understand that the brief history of Russian imperial conquest of the region. So already by the 1830s, 1840s, you start to see I'll back up on use the map. You start to see the Russian Empire slowly take over this steppe. You know, year by year, decade by or yeah, decade by decade, they're kind of setting up settlements in the steppe, restricting the lands of the nomadic Kazakh tribes, especially by the 1840s, 1850s, and they're basically just moving that frontier line further and further. And then the kind of next stage in the Russian conquest of Central Asia really comes in the 1860s. So there's a long history here, but um, partially because of the defeat of the Russian Empire in the Crimean War, they're looking for a place to expand their empire to show the other empires of Europe that they are a legitimate empire. And the way that you do that in the 19th century is by conquering territories, especially in Asia. If you look at like officers' reports at the time, there's parallels where the Russians are talking about the fact that this is um, their version of the British going into India. You can also, there's a famous quote I think by Tolstoy where he says, uh, in Europe we're the Asians, we're the Mongols, but when we go into Central Asia, we're the Europeans. So this is kind of the mentality driving the conquest of Central Asia. And basically from that point onward, first they take Tashkent in 1865. It's this kind of quest, decades long quest um, to find what they call a natural frontier in Central Asia. But they really never get there because they take Tashkent, but then they're worried about facing attacks from the Khanate of Kokand or from Bukhara. So they kind of keep going, and these officers on the ground sometimes are very zealous and take on their own campaigns, but basically you have this process where the conquest just continues and continues, basically until they reach this southern part of Central Asia, close to Afghanistan in the 1880s. And what really stops them is that the British Empire has already conquered Afghanistan at the time, and the two meet in 1895 and basically agree that like north of the Amu Darya belongs to the Russian Empire and south of the Amu Darya belongs to Afghanistan or belongs to British controlled India. That's where they're operating Afghanistan. So this is classic colonialism, complete disregard of what locals wanted. Um, and this is important context because when we get to 1917, this is the map that the Soviets inherit. Any questions about that? Okay, let's talk a little bit about what it looks like to live under colonial rule. We don't have much time for this, but if we think about environment and labor, one important thing is that the empire, like most European empires, sees this as a backward region. This is a region with nomads. People, here's a picture of Kazakh nomads, I think, from the early 20th century, who they see as kind of backward and not fit for modern life, right? Like there's a specific distaste for nomadism. It's seen as incoherent with modern agriculture, modern economy. This is at a time, especially in the early 20th century, when the Russian Empire is trying to improve its productive forces and um, exploit natural resources and exploit labor in order to build up wealth and increase their economic activity. So nomadic lifestyles are seen as counterproductive. The same thing can be true of deserts. It's pretty common among European empires in the 19th and 20th century to see deserts almost as unsettled places that need to be conquered and changed in order to increase your empire's wealth and ability to thrive and compete with the other empires of the world. So this is kind of the mentality that we see developing in the late Russian Empire, and you start to see already by the 1880s, 1890s, and certainly up until World War One, development of new irrigation canals and systems, promotion of, I mean, there's changes in land relations, so there's like a huge concentration of land under fewer and fewer people in the colonial context. And cotton is part of that. So already by the 1890s, 1900s, you see a huge growth in the production of cotton in the region. It does take a couple decades after Russian conquest for this to take off, but the image you see on the right is from, I think, about 1904 in Tashkent. They're already setting up cotton mills, and most of this is being exported to Russia or to other parts of Europe. Raw cotton being sent to be further processed in the imperial core. So a very familiar story. Um, and all of these attitudes get baked into the Soviet system. Um, Often the irrigation experts, the advisors on the national economy in the early Soviet Union are the same people, not a one-to-one, but a lot of the same people who also worked for the Tsarist system in Central Asia. Especially when we look at like engineers and architects of irrigation infrastructure. And then we get to revolution, which I'm sure you guys at least have, you teach this in your class, but specifically in Central Asia, it kind of poses an initial conundrum for the Bolsheviks because on the one hand, they're supposed to be anti-imperialists. Um, so if you read Lenin in 1912 or 1913, he has a lot to say about the national question and the fact that the way we overthrow global capitalism is by supporting national revolutions and ending imperialism. But there's a lot more compromise once the Bolsheviks are in power. So, on paper, um, the countries, these republics, newly established republics in Central Asia, should have the right to leave the Soviet Union and should have actual autonomy and independence. But in reality, a lot of, there's centralization of political power in the Soviet Union, and it's not realistically possible for them to leave and form their own governments. There are attempts to do this actually in 1918, 1919, there's like, for example, in Kokand, there's an autonomous government that's overthrown by the Red Army. Similar things in Samarkand, Bukhara, some of these places. And, in the I guess from like 1916 to 1922, 23, Central Asia is very chaotic. There's a civil war going on, but it's not the same civil war as in Russia. You have different factions fighting each other. You have an anti-Soviet rebellion that's based out of Afghanistan coming back and forth across the river. It's quite a chaotic situation. You also have the Red Army is there, but they're mostly made up of Russian peasants and workers who are, confined to these cities. They don't know anything about the countryside, so it's a really chaotic situation. Um, there's also a rebellion before the revolution that spreads like wildfire through Central Asia because at some point the Tsarist military tries to start recruiting Central Asians for the war effort, which goes very poorly because up to that point they were not required to be conscripted into the Tsarist military, and basically that leads to widespread rebellion, and then that a year later leads to the same people being mobilized against the new Soviet government. So um, I would say until 1922, 1923, it's really difficult to say that any revolution has happened in Central Asia. It's a chaotic situation with all of these competing interests. But by 22, 23, the Red Army is able, they've won the Civil War in Russia, and they're able to establish some degree of control over um, Central Asia itself. And then, they're Bolsheviks, so they want to start enacting radical policies. You get land reform in 1924 and 1925, which is basically, the Red Army going around these villages, trying to figure out who's rich, who owns the land, who's the poor peasant, and doing land redistribution. And part of this is they want to get those productive forces of cotton production moving again, because during the Civil War things have really slowed down. And so they figure that one way to build support for their program and to increase the productive forces of the economy is through land redistribution. And this works to some extent, although, they're producing less cotton than they were in 1890 or 1900, and certainly nothing compared to what's going to come in the next 15 to 20 years. Okay, this is like crash course Central Asian history, so I hope you're enjoying our breakneck speed. Then collectivization comes. So I'm sure you're familiar with the history, Stalinism. Stalin basically gets rid of all of his opponents by the late 1920s, and then says, okay, we're gonna like carry forward with the revolution. We're gonna collectivize agriculture, and we're gonna really transform the Soviet Union. And in places like Kazakhstan, Ukraine, this is extremely deadly because they're doing grain requisitioning, they're seizing livestock. In the parts of Central Asia that we're looking at, where that become cotton growing, most of the violence is enacted towards, much like elsewhere in the Soviet Union, like so-called rich peasants, which is really hard to define, but basically people, sometimes it's people who had several hectares or acres of land. Sometimes it's just somebody who happens to have a cow or two in the village. It's decided on the ground, and it's very messy. Um, on the other hand, so who else is targeted? Religious officials. So there's also an ongoing campaign against Islam at the time. Most of the mullahs, or the local ulema, like the religious judges and stuff, are also attacked. A lot of them are sent to Siberia, sent to the Gulag system. Um, some of them return in the 1950s, but a lot of them die in this system. But for our purposes, what we're interested in is this is a huge step forward in building cotton monoculture in the region. So you collectivize the land, you're stripping it from those rich, so-called rich peasants. You're setting up these collective farm. Often this is a very coercive practice with, Red Army militants or party agitators going into the village, basically forcing people to collectivize, and then you're setting up these cotton growing collectives. At the same time, you're building huge irrigation projects. So, one of them in Tajikistan is actually one of the biggest in Central Asia. They already start doing that in 1932. This is the Vaksh Dam project. Basically, the Vaksh is a huge river that goes from central to south Tajikistan, and then is a major tributary of the Amudarya River. Yeah, we'll talk about child labor in just a bit. And then by the end of the decade, in the Fergana Valley, which is like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, they're using mass mobilization of peasant labor, essentially, to build these dams in like 40, 50, 60 days. And what they tell people is like, show up, bring whatever tools you have in your house, and we're going to just dig ditches and build these huge dams so that we can irrigate these cotton fields. And so, if we look at the statistics, there's actually a huge increase in the amount of cotton that they're producing between 1932 and 1938. This is social revolution, this is economic revolution, this is, political revolution, and it completely changes the history of the region, I would say, even up to this point. Then World War II comes along. There's a huge disruption of the economy. They're still producing cotton, but again, the political control over the region kind of falls to the wayside because everything's focused on fighting that war. And Central Asians, a lot of Central Asian men and some women also play an active role in the combat of the war. But the majority of Central Asians are contributing to the home front, as it were. And yeah, if we look at the cotton numbers and its production during World War II, like it slumps off from 1941 to 1944. And then you start to see a revival after, as the war effort comes to a close. Okay, so that brings us to the main part of what I'm looking at in my dissertation. And how are we on time? I forgot to, okay. We started at what time? We're at like a half hour or something.
Yeah, we
All right.
started at 6:30 and we go to
Okay.
8. So you
Okay.
have time.
Okay. Cool. Cool. Okay. So the war is over. Um, you know that story. I'm not going to get too much into it. But basically, you get to the end of the war, and there's an attempt to try to restore the economy to what it was before the war. And then already by the late Stalin period in the late 40s and early 1950s, the goal is now to expand cotton production way beyond what we had seen in the 1930s. So between, especially like 1965 and 1980, I would say if we're looking at Tajikistan state and party planners, together with those collective farm managers, increased the amount of cotton production from around, yeah, here's actually the 1940 numbers. So um, this is around, if you translate this to tons, this is around 100,000, close to 200,000 tons per year in 1940. That number is over 600,000 by 1965, and then it reaches a million in 1980. Um, and the second thing you really have to understand about this process is, it really began in the late 1950s, was accelerated under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, and continued until the 1980s. But it was achieved primarily by expanding the land that was available for growing cotton. And this was, of course, primarily through irrigation. So this is just kind of to give you an idea of like arable land that's actually being planted with cotton. And you can see that like most of the growth of um, cotton production comes from the fact that they're expanding land. So they're not getting more efficient in the use of specific parcels of land. They're just um, diverting more and more rivers to new fields so that they can grow more cotton. And so basically, the increases in yields of cotton correspond very closely with the increases in total area sowed with cotton, and this is primarily through irrigation. And so to achieve this new irrigation, it's of course not as simple as diverting rivers, especially when we look at Tajikistan. And this is actually a case where Tajikistan differs a little bit even from the other Central Asian republics that are growing cotton, because as I mentioned, 93% of the land in Tajikistan is mountainous terrain. It's not really suitable for land cultivation. So they really are trying to find those valley regions that haven't already been planted with cotton and expanding the irrigation access there. And that's really only in like 3 or 4 valleys throughout the republic, mostly in these western parts. So there's so the Seay Daria is actually, you can see the mouse, right? Yeah, so the Seay Daria is running through here, and they're diverting huge parts of that. And then the Vaksh is running like down this way until it hits the Amu Darya and then follows basically that border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. So they're diverting that at as many places as possible. Like on the Vaksh River, they build like 9 or 10 major dams in like a 20-year span. Um, and they're building hydroelectric power stations in pretty much every place that they can. Um, but yeah, I mean, this is the main tactic for like expanding cotton production. And okay, I have a question in the chat. I always thought quintals were an Andean measure. Is it much more broadly used? All I know is that in the Soviet context, like the metric system is used, and then they use these quintals because it's like a derivative of the metric system. Um, and they have this very elaborate system of uh, like they measure the harvest this way. So they even like go down to like every single hectare. They measure like how many quintals of cotton are we getting per hectare, and there's a whole reward system within the collective farm system based on like those numbers. And you start to like, I mean, even me just reading the newspapers, I start to internalize like what's a good harvest per hectare and what's bad. You know, if you hit like 34, 35 quintals per hectare, you're like um, meeting Stalin or something, you know. Anyway, so it's not so easy to just divert the river once you've already diverted the river everywhere you can, and there's no new land available. So they start to get more and more creative about how to do this. And I could talk about many projects, like if I'm looking at Tajikistan between like 1949 and 1980, I can think of like 7 or 8 different major projects where they're doing something like this. But I just want to point out one. So this is from the late 60s, and this is from the central part of Tajikistan. Let me find it on a map. Oh, here's a good map. So this is like basically right here. It's a district called Yavan. And you can't see it that well on this map because they don't have mountains here, but the Vaksh is running down this way. And then this is like a valley on the other side of a mountain. So it's like you have the river, then you have a mountain separating this valley from the river. And their strategy, you can see it here. So here's the river, and then between the river, here's the valley. The striped area is kind of the land that's going to be irrigated. And this kind of blank space is actually a huge mountain that separates the river from the valley. And so what they're going to do, and I think it's like it ends up being like, you know, 9 miles or something of tunnel under the mountain. They're gonna dig a huge tunnel in the middle of the mountain to bring that water from the river into the valley. And so, you know, this is like the rhetoric at the time is like we're, you know, for thousands of years, the people of this valley have dreamed about irrigation and water, and now we're finally bringing it to them. Of course, this is completely fictitious, but this is what they're saying at the time. So they actually bring the Moscow Metro Company, the same company that like built the Moscow Metro in the 1930s, and they said, "You're gonna build this tunnel in the middle of this mountain, somewhere in the middle of Tajikistan, um, and you're just going to go through this cliff rock, and it, you know, it takes like 6 or 7 years. I mean, they're going like centimeters at a time. I read the recollections of one of the workers who was involved with this, and they actually like created a mine shaft down the middle of the mountain, and then they're just like using jackhammers and drilling through the rock. And he's like, you know, if you made it 80 centimeters in a day, that was good. That was like a good day of work. So it's like, you know, they're doing this for years and years. And yeah, so they start this project, I think, around like 1961. They're really starting the work in 1962, but they're, you know, working with all these institutions to develop the project um, at that time. And so uh, it takes several years because they start the digging in 1962 of the tunnel, and they don't have water coming through the tunnel until the end of 1967. So it's a pretty significant project. And I'll talk about how they build the dam in a minute, but basically you build the tunnel and then the water comes out, and some of the water immediately dumps down into the valley, so they have a canal going that way. But then they also have all of these like hydroelectric like locks essentially to bring the water up into the valley because it's also on a slope. So from like a technical standpoint, if we compare it to what they were doing in the 1930s, it's something totally different because, you know, I talked about the Fergana Canal or the Vaux Canal in the 30s, and the like that was bring your rakes and shovels, and we're going to build a big dam in the middle of nowhere. Now they're using explosive jackhammers. They're using like all these complicated mechanical systems to move the water uphill. This has completely changed, and it's kind of, I think it reveals a little bit like the absurdity of trying to find, doing everything you can to just like add a little bit of acreage of cotton production in the Republic, Um, so here, yeah, here's some of the construction workers from I think this is from 1965, working on the tunnel. So these are the people who would have been doing the jackhammer stuff. And here's the tunnel when it's completed on the other side. So the water is going to come through this side. And it says here, the tunnel is complete. The Obi Kick, that's the name of the valley, one of the valleys. The Obi Kick Valley is except the water from the Vaux River, Abikik Valley. Um, and I also visited the same place, so they're still using it today. That's me in front of the same exact location in 2023. Um, but it's not the only issue they had. So if we go back and look on the other side of the mountain where they're building this this big dam, they also have to find a way to stop the river. And traditionally, what they would have done is built like a concrete dam. And this is very time and labor intensive. But at this point, they're really trying to get this thing done as quickly as possible. And so they come up with a way to save labor on the building of the dam, and they actually explode. They use dynamite and explosives to essentially blow up a huge part of the mountain, sending it into the river, where all of this rock is going to fill. This is called a rock fill dam, but all this rock is going to fill the dam that they've built, stop the water, and then send it through the tunnel. So I don't think you'll get the audio, but we're going to watch. They actually recorded this and put it on. Put it on television and newsreels and everything like that. So it was kind of something that they celebrated at the time. But let's watch that clip. Oh, okay. I was trying to pause it because I think you can. So you can kind of see the area of the dam. So yeah, the rock like dumps into this uh, spot where they've built the partial dam, and it prevents some of the water from going further downstream, and then they can divert it into the tunnel and then over into the next valley. So this is the kind of you know to use someone else's phrase, the human engineering that they're coming up with um, to make this stuff happen. But when they get to the other side, they're also using bulldozers to flatten the land. Sorry, on the side of the dam, they're using bulldozers to flatten the land surrounding the banks of the dam. They're building roads. They're building power lines to connect electricity to that side of the dam. Eventually, they build a hydroelectric station there as well. You have workers mostly recruited from the local villages, like laying concrete, moving rocks, operating cranes and excavators, all kinds of stuff. And, they're working for years, 2 and 3 shifts around the clock to make all so that they can grow more cotton. But the use of explosives is what's kind of unique about this project in particular, and it shows that like um, the 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 use of technology that the Soviet Union was willing to use to transform environment, whether it's with the explosives or the jackhammers, is something that's changing in the 20th century. And as the 20th century moves along, and you have similar projects like these in Australia at the time. Like this is part of a global phenomenon, but it's interesting to see how much the Soviet Union is changing just in the matter of like 3 or 4 decades. So projects like these were kind of carried out throughout Tajikistan. Like I said, if we look at Tajikistan alone, we can identify 7 or 8 projects like these. Sometimes it's not through mountains, but it's like, okay, we're going to build a new settlement in the middle of this desert, and we're going to build like miles and miles and miles of canals to bring water from this place to that place and try to grow cotton literally in the middle of a desert. And, this goes pretty horribly. And as time goes on, the I don't want to say desperation, but like the places that they identify as potential new frontiers for growing cotton does seem to be like more and more ridiculous to the point where like I have one case study from the 70s and 80s where it's literally in the middle of a desert. They're trying to build these long networks of canals, and sandstorms that just sweep across this desert halt their progress like every year. So they restart the project like 4 or 5 times until it kind of works, but it falls apart after like 3 or 4 years of growing cotton, and then the Soviet Union collapsed. So like, um, they're trying to do all this engineering up until 1988, 1989, which is kind of interesting. But this quest of trying to just find new places to grow cotton, and it reveals to us that this is like their main strategy for expanding any kind of production in Tajikistan. So um, okay, so that's the Tajikistan section, but I wanted to bring it back to some of the reading, which I told you about, because these policies, we can see that like in these individual cases, whether it's the one I was just talking about with the Rockfield Dam and the explosives, or the one in the middle of the desert, we can see that this is changing environments and society at like the village level, at the district level, but it's also contributing. If we look at the bigger picture, it's contributing to the destruction of the Aral Sea, because every time they're building these canals, diverting the water, that's less water that's going into the Aral Sea, which, if you remember, um, we had that good map. Yeah, so if these are all feeding into the Sir Darya and Amu Darya, and that water is being diverted, then this Aral Sea itself, which has its own fishing industries, its own, I mean, it's a natural ecology that's being destroyed. It's literally disappearing over time, and this happens really fast because, like I mentioned, the main expansion of cotton production is not happening under Stalin in the 1930s, but it's actually happening in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So if we look at the pictures, like here's the Aral Sea in 1977, here's what it looks like by 1989, and then we see that this continues after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because here's what it looks like in 2006. So this kind of set a pattern into motion that really, the roots of it were in Stalinism, but it really took a life of its own in the 60s and 70s. And, there were experts at the time who already by the late 60s, early 70s started to notice that something was changing, and that, it turns out you can't just divert as much water as you want, that it is going to have an effect. But I don't think they realized the extent to which it would lead to the destruction of the Aral Sea. Um, and so, you know, I guess I would want to open it up to you at this point, because I know you read that article from the 17 moments in Soviet history, but the quote in there was that in 1999 people were saying that this is one of the most notorious ecological catastrophes of human making. And I wanted to pause and pose a question to you all, which is, you've heard my pitch, you've heard my explanation of how I think this changed, but what role does environment and like Soviet policy, like how do they interact, and how does this actually lead to this destructive combination that we end up with the Aral Sea, which can be described as one of the most notorious ecological catastrophes of human making. Maybe another way to think about it is, how is this similar or different to other environmental disasters that you know about?
I would say that, different countries find ways that their environments can be utilized for different crops or different products, and then they over utilize those
Mm-hmm.
environments or lands to the maximum, and
Mm-hmm.
then they for profit, and then they're deemed then like useless for a while because they really have destroyed them,
Mm-hmm.
and then the people are then you know kind of left to repair them. And
Mm-hmm.
so, those local communities are left with unusable land for a while, and then they have to figure out how they can carry on and then repurpose. So I would say that for many of
Yeah,
these local
yeah,
communities,
yeah, and I think
generation
like,
after generation. Yeah.
yeah, and I think exactly what you said. I mean, if we look at both ends of it, right? Like on the one hand, you have the cotton growers who like, a lot of the people I talk to, they actually identified with it. It's kind of like when you talk to people who grew up in coal country or something. It's like they know that this system is bad for them. They know that it like contributes to environmental degradation and ultimately poverty, but at the same time, it's how they fed themselves. So there's kind of a complicated relationship there. But if you go to the other side, the Aral Sea fishermen, if you talk to them, I mean, this is a story of devastation and destruction. There is no livelihood here. It's a disappearing livelihood. So yeah, I think in some ways it's a very familiar story. I think what's unique about the Soviet Union might be the 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 fact that it's like there's not um, like political control is centralized, and this plan of developing cotton fits with state ideology, so there's nothing to kind of like check that drive for more and more and more production, and that's how you end up with something like this. Did anyone else want to weigh in on that, or?
Well, I'm also wondering about state repair of the damage that's done. So I would
Mm-hmm.
take this example and compare to the local community with my students. And we used to be a lumber town. And then when everything was clear cut, they said, oh, farmers come in. And so they sold the land at a
Mm-hmm.
cheap price for farmers. And then that was only good for a couple of years because the topsoil, and so we ended up doing some kind of desertification. And then in the
Mm-hmm.
1930s, FDR came in and with the CCC all over Wisconsin and
Oh,
tried to, do some damage control or some repair. So then the question would be, the aspect of the state, the Soviet state, in not wanting to, try to do some aspect of repair.
yeah. No, it's a really good question, and thanks for connecting it to the situation in Wisconsin. Um, so during Perestroika, basically in the 1980s, when there is this moment of where you can talk critically about things, there are projects and ideas about like how we can restore the Aral Sea, we can reduce cotton production, we can try to, I mean, sometimes the thinking gets like a little bit fantastical. Like at one point they talk about diverting rivers from Siberia to repopulate the Aral Sea, which seems like it would just cause other problems. I mean, they don't go forward with it because the Soviet Union collapses. There are these like attempts within the system to try to, think about repairing it, but of course, because the Soviet Union falls apart in 1991, those are pretty much dashed. I mean, Kazakhstan has done an okay job of um, r- trying to repair part of their northern part of the Aral Sea, because it actually like is at the border of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. But that's also because they're not as reliant on the cotton monoculture. They have gas and oil supplies. They have a more diversified economy than Uzbekistan or Tajikistan, which after 1991, um, Uzbekistan basically continues the same policies of growing cotton. They're not growing it at the same exact level, but like the majority of small farmers are still reliant on cotton, and because of the way that the irrigation systems have been set up, they don't really. Oh, someone's echoing. I'm not sure. Okay, I think it's fixed. They don't really have a choice because to gloss over a very complicated history, the collective farm system is just demolished. That land's broken up, and then you have small farmers who basically can only grow one thing, cotton. So they're really trapped in this system where they're set up to do one thing. They know it's not sustainable long term, but they have no other choice because they have to kind of continue and try to get a livelihood. So yeah, it's not like ironically, the collapse of the Soviet Union has only made these problems harder, and in some ways, this is like what makes this case of Soviet Central Asia very similar to like other post-colonial contexts. Okay, I think we had um, a well. Let me just say a couple more things, kind of conclude, and then we'll just open it up for conversation. So. Um, I think what I'm trying to show with all of this material, and unfortunately, I could only talk a little bit about the bigger project where I talk about all kinds of things like other irrigation projects. Resettlement is a huge thing, so I didn't really talk much about labor, but um, there's forced resettlement, especially around these new irrigated zones, because if they're irrigating a place where people weren't living before, they're taking people from highland, forcing them onto lowland to set up these new collective farms, and this continues through the 1970s. Um, I think Gunell also mentioned the issue of child labor, which is like a practice that develops in the Soviet period and then actually intensifies after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then I also look at like the use of pesticides, the use of chemical fertilizers. I mean, these also contribute to this expansion of cotton production in the 60s and 70s. And interestingly, in Tajikistan, there's a huge push from Tajik entomologists and health kind of like epidemiologists against DDT. Actually, I have a chapter where I show that the move to get the Ministry of Agriculture of the Soviet Union to abandon DDT starts in large part because of Tajik experts who can see very clearly the harmful impacts that pesticides use in cotton is having on harvests, but also on public health. And they're aware of this already by the late 1950s and early 1960s, which is kind of incredible. But yeah, I mean, I've tried to show that like the local ecology, the aridity and the kind of environment of Central Asia informs Soviet policies, and then that ideology and environment kind of bounce back and forth off each other and drive this monoculture. I've also tried to show that like the lack of land specific to Tajikistan and the use of new technologies shapes the way that they expand irrigation into, for example, the Yvonne Valley that I talked about. And also, we talked a little bit about the legacy of these policies today, both in terms of the destruction of the Aral Sea, but also how post-Soviet Central Asian countries and their farmers continue to be kind of trapped in this system of cotton monoculture. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I hope you found this interesting, and now we can open it up for discussion.